Find battlefield strength using battle structures.
Good morning. Wonder and transformation. For me, that is what draws a lot of us to SSE. It's what has drawn me to this field of exploration in general. And it, for me, started 20 years ago when I had my first out-of-body experience. I first became curious based on conversations with friends. That curiosity led me to read everything I could find. Some of it was scientific literature. So the work of people like Janet was instrumental, but then also experiential works, like Bob Peterson here, read his book, he played a big role, but so many others, William Baldwin and so on. So once convinced that these experiences were not something fringe, in the sense that millions of people have been having them throughout history, that there was at least some indication that these experiences could be more than just in one's head, or at the very least that they provoke positive outcomes, then I decided, well, the proof is in the pudding. I just have to experience it myself. And once I did, it was quite transformative and addictive. So I kept trying to help them. And then that led to interest in bioenergy, biofield, and so on. That curiosity led me to the Bear Laboratory, where I was fortunate to see the laboratory towards the tail end and experience the interaction, potential interaction between consciousness of being and machines. That was particularly appealing to me as a budding engineer. I was still just first in high school, then in college. I thought that in order to promote this change, this transformation, this wonder and awe that consciousness can bring, the best thing I could do is engage in education. So I facilitated education experiences through organizations like ICRL, IAC, and so on, as a volunteer while I was pursuing my engineering career. More recently, I have realized that the narratives that we are using, the applications that we are advocating for, are highly technical. They're of interest to us consciousness nerds here, but it's really a little boring or just mildly interesting for most people out there. And to me, that's unfortunate, because really I think millions of people can benefit from the work that we are doing here. So IACT, this company I helped found, is just an attempt to experiment with these different narratives, to try to reach out to a broader audience. Of course, it won't go as deep as we go here, but it's sort of a doorway into the rabbit hole of Alice in Wonderland that we have here. So the approach that we're taking is that some of the things that we're studying here can be quite good for your well-being, right? They can help to provide insight into anything you do as well. So we think that, obviously, people that work in a healthy environment can have more development, professional and personal, and can enjoy more well-being. People who feel better, perform better in terms of creativity, innovation, in terms of even less sick days, more productive, and so on. So as far as exactly what we're doing, we're trying to apply some of what we learn at conferences like SSE and through our own personal experiences and experiments to apply all of this for transformation, transformative techniques, technology for individuals, organizations, and communities as well. That might mean mentoring, training, or actual R&D. One way that we're trying to frame this emerging field of application is kind of piggybacking on the AR, VR craze, right? And calling some of what we're studying, the space where a lot of these experiences exist, a sort of consciousness reality. You know, sometimes I fear that we will encourage people to wear goggles and just sort of disappear into this virtual world, when we have within us a bottomless well of creativity, of innovation, and of genuine potential. And that's maybe, arguably, there's nothing more real than what's within us. So we want to complement AR and VR with CR, sort of consciousness reality. And for that, we work with fellow organizations to explore these experiences and how these experiences might be beneficial to everyday people. And then we also work on technologies that facilitate some of these experiences. They might be apps, or they might be actual apparatus. Some of it uses vibrations, vibroacoustics to be specific, or other sort of sound-based technologies to provoke or facilitate the experiences. And others are just making sure that I don't have to be at 1,000 places at once to teach an OB technique, right? Now, we have been successful as a community to try to begin to show benefits of what we do, even if it's at a more superficial level. And you know, big companies are paying attention to it. Even the U.S. military is paying attention to it, just in terms of coping with stress and being more innovative and so on. Even in sports, you start to see attention being paid to things like mindfulness, biofield related practices, and so on. And in my field, in our professional field, I'm an electrical engineer. Safety plays a big role, and it's known that for example, most injuries are due not to the inherent hazards of, for example, high voltage electricity. It really begins with states of mind, or mindlessness, to be more specific. So obviously focus, calm, tranquility can go a long way. And that can represent saving lives and saving considerable sums of money. So that's all well and good. So we know that it can help well-being and performance, and that this is something relevant and is in the minds of business leaders all over the world. But the underlying mechanisms are still something that most people wouldn't feel comfortable talking about in a workplace, right? So it would be helpful to detect this energy and to make it something more mundane for the everyday world. It's just a big part of the world. Now, you already heard about how you might be able to detect energy, and the lecture after me will also be related to that. And the difficulty remains, though, that just like it's difficult to show somebody an out-of-body experience, as McNamara discussed yesterday, it's also difficult to drag someone in a lab and show them about bioenergy. So as an engineer, I tried to also come up with some sort of low-budget version of bioenergy, cultural transformation technology, something that could be easily done in a school science fair, for example, or at your home, and that, of course, could then be made in a lab as well. So at IAC, we are doing some sophisticated things as well, using fMRI. We have shown that bioenergy can be detected, at least some states appear to be detected with fMRI, and that things that don't appear possible have been showing up on fMRI. So when someone enters a particular energy state, like what's called vibrational state, this resonant state of feeling that your entire field is resonant, energy appears to go beyond the brain. It's something like you're not supposed to have brainwave activity outside your brain, but that's what the fMRI imagery appears to indicate. So that's just something I can discuss in a different venue. But that is something we're doing. But again, fMRI is very expensive. It requires people who are highly trained. It's hard to get your hands on So we are moving beyond that as well into something a lot cheaper and more accessible. So you can go to Walgreens or whatnot and buy some carnations, right? And so I just picked white carnations because they're easy to get. White just because it would provide contrast between the original healthy state and the wilted state. It would be visually contrasting. And you can essentially use these flowers as biological sensors of biofuel. And you can set up an experiment whereby you have a few flowers. In this case, you can have 3 flowers, 3 jars. They're sufficiently distanced apart from each other, and they have the same amount of water, same amount of sunlight exposure, no additional nutrients, just the same amount of water. And you try to keep all relevant physical parameters the same. You can rotate the position of the jars, and one of these jars will be treated differently than the others. So the experimental jar would simply receive emissions of this intention. So yesterday we talked about attention units or intention units. We talked about biofield emissions. So however you want to frame it, you're going to have the user, the operator, the subject emit energy the best that they can, emit their positive intention, try to establish rapport with this flower. They might give it a nickname, and almost endear it as a pet, and just sort of ignore the other two. So that's pretty much what myself and a colleague did in university, and just as a little pilot, exploratory thing, not really a formal experiment, but just to see if it was viable, right? And at the time I didn't have my lovely iPhone camera, so I have really crappy pictures. I apologize. But just to give you an idea, right? That after, say, a couple of weeks, at the top you have a normally wilted flower, which was the control, and then you have the flower that received the intention, right? So you see the most wilted flower in terms of the set of flowers that received the intention, and the least wilted flower that did not receive any attention, just to be conservative. And still, it was visually striking. You could just tell that was a difference. Both my set and my colleague's set. So we thought it was viable, but that's where we left it. We said, okay, that was fun. It was a good personal experience. But then more recently, I've thought about how could we actually measure that? Could we come up with some sort of numerical assessment of that difference that is visually obvious, but it was hard to put a number to it. So by taking these photos, you could crop out just the flower without any background, take the largest crop that you can, and then you can run it essentially through a software program that will analyze the color, the pixels. And so I looked at the CMYK content of each sample and looked for how much black hue each one had. And of course, since one is darker than the other, there's an obvious difference in how much black content darkness each sample has. And this is an easily available algorithm. And so the idea is that we want to not just have experiences, we want to also be able to quantify that as much as possible. So the attempt was to come up with some sort of measure. And it was also an opportunity to honor a mentor who spent a lot of time trying to measure some sort of influence that we may have over the physical world. And so we set out to develop a measure that was a ratio, unitless, but that would provide a proportion of difference between the treated and untreated samples. So the most basic kind of measure you could come up with is a ratio like this. Now, whether it's a ratio that measures an energy, a flow of information. Of course, there are different models.